Welcome to episode 25 of the Lizzie Borden podcast. I am your host, Anna Behrens, wife of the late Richard Behrens, who was originator of this podcast and writer of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and sometimes the history of her hometown, Fall River, Massachusetts. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens, each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel Lizzie Borden took an axe, to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Mysteries. Today we are turning the tables and interviewing our usual host, Stefani Koorey. Stefani has quite a bit to share with us about her current endeavor, which is to raise funds to erect a grave marker for Edwin H. Porter. Porter was the crime reporter for the Fall River Globe during the time of the Borden Murders, and author of the first book published on the case, The Fall River Tragedy, A History of the Borden Murders. Stefani Koorey is a Borden scholar and Fall River historian who has authored several books on both subjects. She holds a PhD from Penn State and a library sciences degree in digital libraries from Drexel University. She is the creator and administrator of LizzieAndrewBorden.com, The Hatchet Online, and moderator for the Lizzie Borden Society Forum. In addition, she is the editor and publisher of The Literary Hatchet, produced 3 times a year, a literary magazine that publishes short stories, poetry, and illustrations, and original artwork from authors and artists worldwide. She works closely with the Fall River Historical Society on their historical and graphic projects, and most recently edited the Jennings Journals along with the curator Michael Martins and the assistant curator Dennis Bennett. Stefani is also the host of her own YouTube channel, Mondo Lizzie Borden, where she cracks open the myths surrounding the Borden case, as well as serves as the host of this podcast, the Lizzie Borden podcast, assuming the reins from the late Richard Behrens, its creator. And now, the Lizzie Borden podcast presents an interview with Stefani Koorey. Welcome, Stefani.
Hi.
Thanks for being here again. Let's get started.
Pleasure.
We all know the first book on the Borden case was written by Edwin H. Porter. How important is this book to Borden historians? Can you put it into an historical context for us?
Sure. Edwin H. Porter was the crime reporter for the Fall River Daily Globe. So he was there that morning, the day of the murders. He was one of the cited reporters who was going in and out of the house, asking questions of people, investigating the crime from the very beginning. He was the main author of all of the articles on the crime from the Fall River Daily Globe. And he was present at almost all days of the trial in New Bedford for the trial of Lizzie Borden. So he had a front row seat, I guess, to the circumstances, the crime, the people, etc. In addition, he was a part of the story in that he was present in the jail in Fall River when Lizzie supposedly told her sister, "You have given me away." He was the reporter who broke that story. Now, we don't know what this jailhouse remark refers to. We don't know what it means. It created quite a controversy at the trial. And he was also so important that he's in the trial transcripts by name, mentioned 12 times, even though he wasn't called as a witness. Other reporters were, but he was not. I don't think he was available that day is the reason why. People knew him. We know some things about him because of the trial. We know that he only had sight in one eye, but we don't know why, because they mention it in the trial. And he was this presence about the case. So in January of 1893, way before the trial begins in June for Lizzie, he lets it be known he's writing a book about the case. That's kind of a unique thing. We think now, with the Murdoch murders, where books come out left and right away. after the murders or during the investigation or after the trial, a book will come out in seconds. He was one of those people that did that first. He had amassed so much information from his writing that he put together a book about the case before the verdict was even given. So he let it be known he was writing this book on the Borden case and created a bit of a scandal with Borden, Miss Borden, Lizzie Borden. And she, I guess I could use the word sicked. She sicked her lawyer on him. And the lawyer wrote him a letter, and in papers as far away as Boston reported that they told him in no uncertain terms, was he to write anything that was untrue or colorful about the story of the murders, and that he could not publish images of any of the Borden family, and including Morse, and including the father, Andrew Borden, nor the defense team. Well, this was in January, and apparently some compromise was reached because he was able to publish photographs of the dead, which is Andrew and Abby, but he did not publish photographs of Lizzie, Emma, John Morse, or the defense. His book also does not come to any conclusion about who did it after the acquittal, much to some people's perception that he was biased. His book is not a biased account of the story of Lizzie Borden. It's a firsthand account of the story. And I think that that is unique in and of itself, that he was there, that it's the first book published on the case. It made its mark. It is a significant piece of work. He gets some things wrong in it, like all authors tend to do. And it seems like he wasn't there for certain days. But remember, he's the crime reporter for the Fall River Daily Globe. And in 1893, in May, we have the murder of Bertha Manchester, which occurs right before the jury is being selected in the Borden case. So he's also covering that case. So there's reasons why he might not be in court every day, because he's also handling this other big murder story that's being published in the newspaper. So he's this important person in terms of the story. He publishes this book in August of 1893, which is 2 months after the trial is over. It's sold by subscription for $1.50. And the Fall River Historical Society and myself own subscription books. What that means, it's the binding of the book as it's going to be finally bound. It has the end papers that are going to be in the final book. It has the cover, it has the spine, but it only has the first 40 pages of the book. And then the back part of it is this fold-out paper where people can sign up to get a copy. So it's a subscription book. And the Historical Society owns the subscription book from the publisher and from Porter. So they were out there selling their book ahead of time before the book was published to get people interested and to pre-sales. So we also have one of these subscription books. It's quite interesting because it actually does include a photograph of Lizzie Borden in it, which was then taken out. The other significant thing about this book is it's the first time anybody saw photographs of the case. Remember, in 1892 and 1893, newspapers did not publish photographs. They published sketches drawn from photographs. So there was no crime scene depictions of the photographic quality in any newspaper ever. He got his hands on the photographs because photographs had been taken of these places and of these people and of these things, but then they had hired sketch artists to create the illustrations that went with the newspapers. The best illustrations were in the Boston Globe. They had, to me, the best sketch artist. The Fall River papers had some really kind of cartoonish kinds of sketch artists, but still, newspapers back then were heavily illustrated, but not with photographs. So this book, coming out in 1893, contained photographic evidence of the case. It contained photographs that we have seen nowhere else in any other book, in any other publication, including the outside of the jail as Lizzie was arriving to the Fall River jail. There's a crowd around the jail, and this is what is depicted there. We can't quite make her out, but that's what the scene is. We see a young Abby Borden that no one had ever seen before. We see both death scenes, Andrew on the couch and Abby on the floor. We see the Taunton jail, which is a lost building because it was torn down later. So there are things that are, the inside of the courtroom even at the time of the trial. So we are privy to the layout of where the jury was and where the defense attorney sat, and, and it's still that same way today, by the way. But this was sensational in so many different ways. So he's really important. And this book is really important. And there was a rumor that has been going around forever that started by Edmund Pearson, who claimed that the book was suppressed upon its publication because he couldn't find hardly any copies of it when he was writing his book, Studies in Murder, in 1924, while Lizzie was still alive. But he was able to obtain a copy. He read it. He sent a copy to William Ruffhead, his friend in Scotland, his crime reporter, writer, lawyer friend in Scotland. So he was able to access the book, but he used the word suppressed. And because he used the word suppressed, it made people go, what is going on here? And every author after that, through the decades, has enlarged upon that to make it a conspiracy theory that Lizzie had, in fact, bought up all the copies and had them destroyed, creating this rarity for the book. The simple truth is that didn't happen. But I think they're misreading the legal cease and desist kind of letter that Andrew Jennings wrote about what you can't put in the book, and conflating it with the suppressed, and also including the lack of copies that are out in circulation. And the reason why the book is not in circulation back then is because people bought it. Lots of people bought it, but then they read it. And it's not a book that necessarily holds up with time. So it could be thrown away, or it could be passed on to somebody else, or they don't even know what they have. It's just this book on the shelf. So you can still buy a copy of Porter's original book, 1893. I've located 5, 6, or 7 of them that are online right now in varying degrees of quality of condition. And price is usually based on a condition. So you can pay as much as $1,500 for a copy of this book, or as little as $250 if you just want an original with some pages that are loose and a lot of foxing and things like that. So I have known book dealers who have told me that they have seen 20 to 25 copies pass through their hands in the 70s and 80s. And that's just one dealer. So we know that this book exists. It's not as rare as people say. And of course, Lizzie did not buy up all of the copies and have them destroyed. So that myth is gone. But yet people think that. So it also increases interest in this book as being a rarity. And then in, I think it was 1985, Robert Flynn, the publisher of King Philip Publishing in Maine, and also a Fall River native, republished an exact reprint of the Fall River Tragedy. So thanks to him, it became a widely read book. It was out there republished because the copyright had expired. And so he picked it up and he published an exact reprint. But in his introduction, he repeats this idea that if you don't read this book, you'll never get your hands on a copy because there aren't any out there. So he's selling something. He also limited the publication to 1,000 signed, numbered copies. And then when he sold out his 1,000, he just reprinted more. So he was just in business for it. And then other authors repeated what he said because he was the guy who published the reprint, so he must know. So anyway, it's this big mess that way. It is available for sale. It's about $25 in hardback. I think you said you could get a copy for like $9 on Amazon because it's in the public domain and other people have published it as paperbacks. The only unfortunate thing in buying one of those is that you're getting a like 8th generation image of an image of an image of an image of an image from the original book. Nobody has the original images that are in the book. Those were Porter's, and we don't know where they are. So even when Flynn reprinted his book, he made a copy of the images from the book in order to put them in his book. So they're degraded a little bit. So if you get an original Porter, you get just a slightly clearer view of what the images are. So he's like super important to me that he did this and he was there. Anybody that was there is important. What they have to say is important. The Jennings journals are important because all those people were there. Jennings was there. He interviewed the people who were there. That's firsthand day one commentary on what they knew, what they saw, what they believed. Even if what they're introducing is gossip, it's from then, not from now. It's not been diluted by time or affected by other people who want to add their 2 cents in and make it even more conspiratorial in any way, like it has become. I mean, this is a huge conspiracy case now, unfortunately. It's really sad. But Porter was the guy.
Yeah.
And so
I was just going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about his life. I know you investigated it.
It's so sad. He had such a sad life, really and truly. He was born in Kentucky. His obituary says he was born in 1864 to Columbus Porter and Margaret Davis. Kentucky in 1864. We all know what that means. That's Civil War time. But we don't really know if it's really 1864. Using all the census records from 1870, 1880, and 1885, when he was in the Dakotas, it makes sense that he was probably born in 1863. Now, a year difference, who cares? Well, the problem is we're trying to place a stone on his grave, and I was trying to get a birth record for Edwin Porter so I could put a birth date as well as his death date. We will never get his birth date or his birth record. I was in touch with various municipalities in Kentucky that should be holding birth records. And I was told by the archivist for Metcalfe County that there are no birth records from 1861, the end of 1861 to 1872. None. Wow. And she said to me, they were kind of busy back then doing other things, referring to the Civil War.
Right.
So Metcalfe County, where Edwin Porter was ostensibly born, was a very small populated rural place anyway. It had a population of about 7,000 people in the whole county. And it still is very rural. It only has 10,000 now, all these years later. So it's a very rural part of southern Kentucky. His brother's birth is recorded in 1861 in the records of Metcalfe County, but anything after that is just not there. And I didn't realize that that kind of wall would hit me about birth records. I didn't realize that a generation of birth records were lost because of the Civil War. I just always assumed that people were still keeping things like that. But in the South, no. And definitely not in this part of the world. So we think he's born in 1863 and 1864, but we can't put that on a headstone. Anyway, he was educated in Kentucky. He studied in Louisville. He was a school teacher for a time, and he studied typesetting. And apparently the typesetting part is what led him to being a reporter. And he must have been quite good at typesetting and must have been quite an expert at it, because in 1899 in Fall River, he testified as an expert witness on type, font, and sizing at a trial concerning some illicitly labeled maple syrup. It's actually in the newspaper. So he was some kind of like savant as far as type and typesetting was. Anyway, he worked at lots of different newspapers. He worked in Louisville at the Courier Journal. He worked in Memphis, New Orleans, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And in the late 1880s, he was working for the Providence Telegram in Providence, Rhode Island. We know that. But then this new paper opens up in Fall River, and it's not the Globe. It's a newspaper called the Tribune. In April of 1890, this new newspaper starts, and Porter starts working there, comes over from Providence, moves to Fall River, and then becomes its city editor. So he's moving up. And then right after that, the whole newspaper crashed and went out of business. So it was in business for less than like 7 months, unfortunately. I found out that it was due to mismanagement of the funds, so the investor money, and also union issues, because there's quite a union situation going on with typesetters and the people that make a newspaper happen, as opposed to the management of newspapers. It was happening in Providence as well at the time. But he landed right on his feet, and he got a job as a crime reporter for the Fall River Daily Globe, and the rest is history. So at the time of the murders, he'd only been in Fall River for 2 years. And I imagine him with this Kentucky Southern accent walking around Fall River, if you think about it. He didn't speak like a Yankee. He was Southern. So I find that interesting as well, that he's an outsider, and an obvious outsider because of his accent, that was referred to in his obituary as a Southern gentleman. So he was a nice guy who was well liked. In October of 1891, he gets married to a Fall River girl named Winifred Alice Leonard. And the following year, in October of 1893, which is August, September, October, 2 months after the Borden murders happened, he has his first daughter born, Florence. And then his second daughter, named after his wife, Winifred Alice, is born in August of 1898. This is his little family, his lovely little family. In the city directory in 1904, which really tells us what's going on in 1903, because city directories refer to the collection of the data from the year before. He is listed as both a reporter for the Fall River Daily Globe and a correspondent for the Boston Herald. So he was doing double duty and being published. He doesn't ever have a byline, which is, I think, why people are confused. They didn't do bylines back then, except if you were like in a New York paper, like somebody super important, like Joe Howard or Julian Ralph. Those people had bylines, but he doesn't have a byline. But we know that this is what he did. Now, there were other reporters covering the trial too, so we can't tell which is him and which is someone else, unfortunately. But we know he was there doing that. Really sadly, in February of 1904, which is just 12 years after the murders, he dies of tuberculosis. He had tuberculosis for 4 years and had been taking treatments at Rutland Sanitarium for consumptives in Rutland, Massachusetts, and it had been working, but it didn't in the end. And he died at the age of 39.
Oh, okay.
So he wrote the Fall River Tragedy at the age of 30. He was only 30 years old when he wrote that book. He was 3 years younger than Lizzie Borden. He was a young man during that period of time and had the young energy of the investigative reporter. And then he dies at the age of 39. His wife buys a cemetery plot in St. Patrick's Cemetery in Fall River. They're Catholic. At the time of his death, his wife is only 34 years old, and his 2 daughters are 12 and 5. All the newspapers locally and in Boston also mentioned his death, but the local newspapers go on and on about what a great guy he was and what a wonderful reporter. And we're all so sad, and we've lost a friend and a coworker and a gentleman. Everybody from all the other newspapers said nice things about him too. So it wasn't that he was competing with anyone, it seems. It seems that they were all kind of one of the same, a kind of crowd of reporters who knew one another very well. It's poignant to read his obituaries and the death announcements in the Globe and stuff like that, because they just called him unselfish and loyal and courteous and obliging and straightforward and, just fabulous.
Well, yeah. Why is there no grave marker?
Well, big shock to me. In 2014, a friend of mine, her name is Sherry Chapman, and she was writing a book, and I was publishing it, called Lizzie Borden Resurrections, a history of the people surrounding the Borden case before, during, and after the trial. So she did this thing where she was interested in grave hunting. So she went and got all the birth records of everybody involved in the case, all the friends, all the doctors, all the police, all the family, all the side people, the lawyers. She was interested in compiling biographical information about all the people that were involved in the Lizzie Borden case, and then tracking down where they're buried. So she's got birth and death and obituaries. So she gets these mini biographies of everybody. She finds Porter is buried at St. Patrick's Cemetery. The woman at the cemetery office gives her the location, and she goes to the location, and it's just grass. There's nothing there. So she goes back and she goes, why isn't there a marker? The story that was told to her was at the time of Porter's death, his wife, Winifred, purchased a single double. Sounds so weird to us now. They probably still sell things like that. It's a single double. She bought a single plot that two people could be buried in, one on top of the other. And she paid $10 for the single double. She figured she'd be buried on top of him when she died. She thought, of course, her daughters would get married and grow up and have their own families and then be buried with their families. So she didn't need a family plot. She just needed her and him. But that didn't happen. Poor story happens, which is the sad story of the Porter family doesn't end with Edwin's death. It goes on and on and on. So Winifred Alice, who was born in 1898, she dies of tuberculosis in 1919 at the age of 20. So the grave is opened and the daughter is placed on top of the father.
Oh, I see.
So it's the father and the daughter. And people were confused because she has the same name as the wife, but it's not the wife, it's the daughter. So father and daughter are buried on one on top of the other, and still unmarked, because that was already paid for. So that could be done. But losing a breadwinner made that family destitute. So Winifred never paid for perpetual care, which would have allowed the erection of a tombstone. So if you don't pay the perpetual care, you don't get to put a marker in a grave. That's like an extra fee. Okay. You not only pay the perpetual care, but then you have to pay for the marker. So there's all these other costs involved that she could not afford. If she had paid for the perpetual care back then, when her daughter died in 1919, it might have only cost her $10, $15. And then someone could have put a marker on it later if they had raised the funds. But she never did, and it never happened. There is no marker on the grave at all. And then I lost track of them. I lost track of Florence and Winifred, the mother and the daughter. I couldn't find them anywhere. Luckily, this 1950 census has been released in the past 12 months or so. The 1950 census showed me that Winifred and Florence were together at the Taunton State Hospital in Taunton, Massachusetts, as inmates. Now, people around here know that the Taunton State Hospital is an insane asylum. Were they insane together? Living together at an insane asylum is such an odd thing. So I contacted the Old Colony Museum in Taunton, which holds a lot of the records of the Taunton Hospital. And he said that at the time in the 50s, there was actually an almshouse on the site of the hospital grounds. All the local communities that had almshouses and poor farms had closed them down. Fall River no longer had one. Swansea no longer had one. Westport no longer had one. So what happened was they had erected a poor house there. And people were sent there that couldn't afford to upkeep themselves, to manage. This is before, government assistance. This is before all that stuff. So the daughter and the mother were sent there, and Fall River paid for their keep. And it actually says that they were unable to work. By the time 1950 rolls around, the mother, Winifred, is 79 years old in the almshouse. And the daughter, Florence, is 57. So it was from there that I was able to backtrack and find out that they did live together. They were located in census records prior, and every time they lived in the same location. So they stayed together their whole lives, mother and daughter, which I also thought was unusual. Florence never married. By contacting the Taunton city clerk, I found out that Winifred Porter died December 25th, 1952. And she died in Taunton of cardiovascular disease, arteriosclerosis, and senility. So she died at the Taunton State Hospital. People said, oh, well, then she was buried in the poor grave. They have a grave for paupers in Taunton, for people who die at Taunton in that hospital. But it turns out no. By contacting Michael Martins of the Historical Society, and he contacted the city of Fall River, he found out, no, she's buried in St. John's Cemetery in Fall River. It's a very small cemetery. It's a Catholic cemetery. And the city of Fall River paid for her internment, but there is no grave marker, and she's alone there. So that's where she was placed. So then I'm like, well, what happened to Florence? There's no census records after 1950 that are available. Again, Michael Martins comes to the rescue with the Fall River City Hall and the city clerk, and they find that Florence, dear Florence, dies in May of 1977.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At the Crawford Nursing Home in Fall River. She dies of acute pulmonary tuberculosis, acute pulmonary edema, arteriosclerosis, which apparently runs in that family, and paranoid schizophrenia.
Oh, so that explains.
Now, the city pays for her burial back in St. Patrick's, but not anywhere near her father and sister. She's buried separately without a stone by herself. So the family's sad, sad story is that they're dispersed around the city and none of the graves are marked. But because Porter's so important, Sherry said, and had the idea, we need to put a marker on this grave. How do we do this? So she contacted St. Patrick's Cemetery, and they said, well, if anybody pays for the perpetual care, the money that's owed, you can put a marker on, and you would essentially own the grave. It's such an odd concept. By the time she's investigating this in 2014, instead of $10 or $15, the price is now $320. So she pays the money, and she owns Porter's grave.
Okay, so that's total amount.
That's the total amount for the perpetual care. That's just the permission to put a marker on the grave. So Sherry Chapman owns Porter's grave. We've been going back and forth on how to do this. She doesn't live around here at all. She lives in the Midwest. So I finally said, let's just do this. I go to St. Patrick's and they're like, well, no, you can't do that because you don't own the grave. I said, well, can I buy the grave from her? And she's like, no, that's too complicated. Let's not do that. What you need to do is get a notarized letter from her saying that you have permission to erect the marker. Okay. Time goes by again. And we finally get this notarized letter, and I go back to St. Patrick's, and it's all in the works, and I'm authorized, and they're like, we need $20 from you. And I was like, what's that for? And they're like, oh, you have to have a permit to build a marker. I was like, okay, here's the $20. So I pay for the permit for the marker. Then I start the investigation about how much the marker is going to cost. And oh my word, they are very expensive. I picked Rex Monumental Works. They're in Fall River. They actually are a family-owned and operated monument company. And they started in New Bedford and moved to Fall River. And they've been in business since, get this, 1892. So it's kind of like, oh, well, that works out. I sat down and I talked to them about what I wanted. And apparently, because it's a Catholic cemetery, it has to have a Catholic symbol on the stone of some kind. So I had to pick a Catholic symbol. So I picked the dove. She said, oh, but wait a minute. I don't know if you need the dove with the olive branch or without the olive branch, because some cemeteries demand you have the olive branch in the dove's mouth. So she had to call the cemetery, and the cemetery said, no, that's Notre Dame Cemetery requires the olive branch, but St. Patrick's doesn't require the olive branch in the dove's mouth. I picked a black stone. I thought that would be significantly cool. And they now do laser engraving. So it's all included. And there's going to be a dove in the middle at the top. And I'm going to have I've designed this open book with pages. So you can see that the pages are on the side, so that it's two people are buried here. So on the left-hand side will be Porter's information, and that he's the author of this book, The Fall River Tragedy. And then on the right-hand side will be his daughter's information, birth and death, and, sort of like gone too soon or something like that about her early demise. That's the plan. So the amount of money it's going to cost is $2,600, but I'm adding a couple of $100 into the mix because the GoFundMe company takes a little bit of every donation, like PayPal does, they take a little bit. That's how they stay in business. It's really a tiny amount, but it can add up if you get a lot of small donations. I padded it with the $200. So we're trying to raise $2,800. So far, we've raised $615. And I only know one of the people who has donated. I'm so shocked that it has reached the people that are interested. And there's going to be an article in the Herald News soon about it. So maybe I'll reach more people that way too. And this podcast will reach more people. And
yes. Yeah.
That's great. Why it's so important that people be able to, because people go to Lizzie's grave. People go to Dr. Dolan's grave. People go to Alice Russell's grave in Westport. People go grave hunting. They do. It's a pastime. There's nothing wrong with that. I do that. It's interesting to pay your respects to somebody or to find out where they're buried and look around and kind of have a sense of the place. But nobody could do that with Porter because it's just a field of grass.
Well, do you think this campaign is going to reawaken people's interest in Porter and his work?
I hope so. Yeah. I really do. I hope that people go back to the book and realize that he's not biased in any way, shape, or form, that he doesn't say she did it or she didn't do it. In fact, he leaves it with the verdict, and that's the end of the story kind of thing. He doesn't go on to her life afterwards. And because he was being threatened with a lawsuit if he did, when she was acquitted, I'm sure he had to make sure that he didn't indicate in any way that she was guilty.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does seem, from our perspective now that we can look back on all this time has passed since the trial, but that Lizzie was trying to contain it at the time, and now we're still talking about her.
Yeah, she was trying to contain it in a certain way. What's interesting is that the list of people that were not allowed to be in the book did not include Abby. As far as photographs. So I thought that was kind of funny. It was like, well, you guys really didn't like her that much, did you? So I guess not. You don't mind. Or maybe they thought they had no rights to her because they weren't related. It is possible that it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they had a discordant relationship with her or that they didn't like her. It could have everything to do with they didn't have any rights to her image. And that's why it would be her family that would have to say something. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Because she's not related to Lizzie, and Lizzie's lawyer is representing her. And John Morse was chiming in because he was related to Lizzie. So he didn't want his picture in there either.
Okay. So if we go back to the genealogical study, I understand that sometimes even, online things like Ancestry could be incorrect and don't always have the most up-to-date information, or the links they have don't always link to the correct information. So how did you make sure you had all the right information?
It was a shock to me to know that when people put up a family tree, for whatever reason, whether they're just interested in the person or whether it's a member of their distant relative family, that they often include incorrect information because there's many people with that name in the world. For instance, the Porter's tree includes birth records from Iowa, because there was an Edwin Porter in Iowa. There was one somewhere else. And then they use the brother's birth record as proof of Edwin's birth, but it's not, it's his brother. It's the trees where you have to be wary. The trees contain incorrect information, which then gets fed into Find a Grave. Findagrave.com is crowdsourced. So you could go in there and you could enter a grave, and you could enter a photograph, and you could enter the information and the genealogical information. And you are putting something out there that isn't necessarily true, but you believe it to be true. That's suspect. It's like Wikipedia. Wikipedia gets stuff wrong too, because it's you and me going in there and making edits. We're wrong. What you need to rely on is obituaries in newspapers, and even that can be flowered. That can be sort of embellished.
Right. That's written by family members.
Right. So you have to be careful of that. But at least it's more current and accurate. So obituaries in newspapers, if you can find them. Also, the census records are so important, and military records, whether they were in the Civil War, and their enlistment cards, and World War I and World War II. And there's immigration records that are online through Ancestry. So you have to look at the original source material and not rely heavily on what other people interpret that to mean. That's the trick. And when I was working on the Jennings Journal for the Historical Society, not only assisting in the transcription work of all that handwriting, but in the back, there are 2 sections of biographical information. That was a grueling process of confirming through multiple sources that these people were related to these people, and this was their birth and death, and these were their children, and not some other family's children, and these were their brothers and sisters, and this is what their life really was. I really got my feet wet doing the Jennings journals, locating as accurate as information as I could find to make those as perfect as they could be. So they would check my work and I would check their work, and we were confident in the genealogical work that had been done. I became this kind of genealogical detective, I guess. And so when I got to Porter, I was totally aware of the mess that was out there, the inaccuracies that were there. For instance, the person who runs the Porter family tree has an absolute birth date. There's no way that exists. I know that. So I don't know where they got it from. So that means the rest of the information is suspect too. There's that. It's a complicated situation. And then to find out that people born in Metcalfe County in Kentucky don't have birth records for a certain number of years because of the Civil War was just like, oh, so sad, really, for people who are doing genealogical research. What was it? One thing I did find, which was interesting, was an early census where Porter was a young boy. He was 6 in one, and then he was 16 in the other. And by the time he was 16, his father was a jailer in a community, and listed as a part of his household are 3 inmates. It says inmate. They apparently lived in the house at the jail. At the time the census was taken, these guys were in jail there. That was kind of a humorous thing where I was like, oh, look, he's living with prisoners.
You've had a lot of experience working on genealogies from various members of people in the Borden case.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sherry started with her interest in it since 2014 when she was working on her book, and 2023 today. There is so much more information available. Not only that, but you can have access now to all of the Fall River newspapers until 1923 online. You have to pay for it, but they're there, and they never were there before. So it's searchable. So all of a sudden, I can search for Porter from the time I knew he came to Fall River until after his death and find every mention of him. And that's how things were found. Like he was that expert testimony in that trial, or that, all the other newspapers' obituaries, or I don't have to go to a library and do microfilm day after day after day after day. Just the ability now to sit in your pajamas at home and get online and pay buckets of money to do so, but get into primary source material through Amazon and through newspapers is changing the way we can do history. And I think that that's like a great, great thing. And it just makes me happy. And when I was reprinting for the Historical Society, the Knowlton papers, they had used, I think that book was published in 1998 or 1999 or something. They published the Knowlton papers, and they had a biographical section in the back. When I republished the Knowlton papers, I'm like, all that information, there's so much more information for these people now from when they were having to do it by hand and call the city and get information and try to do a genealogical search using city directories and just the stuff that they had available. That I expanded that for them and included more information that was available than that. I got my feet wet with republishing that for them. And then the Jennings journals, of course, it was all about the genealogy. Because Sawyer, the guy who was tapped by Alan to go watch the side door of the Borden house, here's this guy, Charles Sawyer. Who is Charles Sawyer? He's a throwaway character to me, always was. But I knew he lived a couple of houses down from the Borden house, and he was walking by, and Alan picked him out and said, go. Why him? Right? All of a sudden now I'm like, why did he pick him? Well, it turns out through my studies of genealogy and newspapers that Charles Sawyer was not a young guy. He was like in his 50s when that happened. And he was a noted person in the town. He was a Civil War hero. So he was somebody that the policeman knew and trusted to watch that door because he had been in the Civil War. He had done his duty. He was an older gentleman. He was responsible. And it suddenly made sense because I just picture people as being like, I don't know, 25 years old back then. I don't know why. It's just in my head because the photos we have of these people are of them as very young people. But he wasn't. He was an older man. And his life was much more interesting than I had ever imagined. And I think that that kind of nuance to the story of the characters of the people, I think that just makes it also interesting. Like, I don't really care who killed the Bordens anymore. I will never know. So I can never prove anything. So I don't play those parlor games of trying to figure out who did it. I'm interested in the lives of the people that got sucked into this story. They're just minding their own darn business, and all of a sudden their lives are changed. And I think that those peripheral stories, to me now, are much more interesting than the case itself.
Wow. Well, I know that you're anxious for people to contribute to your GoFundMe. Can you give them some information on how they can do that?
Yes, I think if you go to GoFundMe.com and enter Edwin H. Porter, you'll find it. I'm going to put it below this podcast in the information. description. People can click the link there and go, because otherwise it's just gobbledygook to say out loud. We will love $5, $10, $20, or like that one person gave $500. That would be spectacular. It's an ongoing project, and 100% of the money goes to this project. And if there's anything left over, it will go to charity or to purchase if they allow it. I didn't even find out one of those pewter urns so that people could place flowers at the grave. I'm not sure if St. Patrick's allows such a thing, or to put some flowers on his grave. All the monies will be used for this one purpose. And I just think it's a really worthy cause. And I'm really honored that Sherry Chapman has given me this responsibility and allowed me to pursue this and get the word out. He deserves it. He deserves to be remembered for his importance to the story. And not only that, but because his story was so sad, it would be nice to offer something in return for what we know from him because of him. It's just worth it to me to spend this time and effort to make this happen.
Well, thank you so much, Stefani, for talking with us today about Edwin H. Porter.
I'm really, really glad you asked me about it, because I was like, how else can I get the word out? And then you're like, hey, we could do a podcast. And I'm like, oh, that's so sweet. That is just like, thank you, because it's just a good thing. It just gives me a good feeling to know that people could finally find him.
Right.
Who knows how many people that'll be? That's not important. The fact is, he deserves it. Everybody deserves some kind of a marker, I think, or remembrance. The grave is there and those people are in there. And right now it's just this grassy space. It just adds to the sadness. And I want it to kind of be uplifting for him.
Do you have any kind of time frame, or it just depends on how much you raise the money or how quickly?
I don't know. I thought, oh my gosh, everyone will be so excited and they'll donate and I'll be done in a month. That's my optimism. I imagine through the summer sometime, maybe even into the, Memorial Days and Veterans Days and, those kinds of honoring the dead days that we have in the United States that might bring further, people thinking about such things. It'll last as long as it needs to last in order to raise the money. And I think maybe a benefactor might come out at the end and go, oh, I'll pay the rest of the money. I just imagine the goodness of some people that might happen. I know a bunch of people on Twitter and some famous people, but I don't know if they're like thinking, yeah, I know her that well that I'll give money. So we'll see. I'm just trying to get the word out. So this is just another way to do that. So I appreciate it. Oh, and I did a movie on Mondo Video about the mythology around Lizzie having burned up all the copies of Porter. So I did a whole movie on that. So you can see that on Mondo. I did a video of Porter's life on my Mondo Lizzie Borden channel on YouTube. So there's that. You can go look. And there's pictures and images and more information about the Civil War and its effects on Kentucky and that kind of thing. So there's more detail in that, and photographs of like Taunton and some of the pictures from Porter's book that are remarkable.
Well, thank you I'm sorry, go ahead.
More visual material if, as film requires.
Yes, I've seen those and they're wonderful. I highly recommend them for anyone who's interested in this case or just considering whether or not you're going to contribute.
Yes, my whole thing is that there's too much bad information out there. And so my whole thing is just to kind of fix all that. It's like a one-woman cause, like to make people not think that way anymore because it isn't true. This is true. So go this direction, that kind of things. Because I'm a historian and I care about the truth of the matter that's provable and has evidence behind it. That's why I don't really care if Lizzie did it or didn't do it, because there's no evidence. I can't prove it. So I have little interest in that kind of thing. But yes, these people, these real people, these people who really lived and really had an impact on our understanding of the case, I think, are the most fascinating part of the story now.
Well, thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden podcast, episode 25. We've been talking to Stefani Koorey on her endeavor to raise funds to erect a marker on the grave of Edwin H. Porter, the author of the Borden Tragedy, A History of the Borden Murders, published in 1893. You can find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Thank you so much, Stefani.
My pleasure.